Hello, welcome everybody out there. I understand our broadcast has started. My name is Hector Saldaña. I'm coming live from the Wittliff Collections, the Museum and Research Center at Texas State University. And it's my great honor to introduce, really, there's only two Leilas in the world. There's Leila of the Eric Clapton song, which was famously Patty Boyd, and there's Leila Cobo. Leila Cobo, first of all, is an outstanding journalist and author. She's the vice president of the Latin Music Content Division of Billboard, and she heads up Billboard's Latin Music Conference. She was born in Colombia. Leila came to the United States in the late 80s. She is a classically trained concert pianist, which I was amazed to find out. I'd been a fan of her writing. I did not know that she could tinkle the keyboard as well, beautifully. She's a novelist and a biographer. She's a Fulbright scholar. She was the pop music critic at the Miami Herald before coming to Billboard magazine. Her Latin music guides, I was telling Leila before the beginning of this session, how much, when I was at the San Antonio Express News, that piece in Billboard, sometimes in the middle of the year, sometimes at the year end, those guides were amazing and must read. So I want to introduce Leila Cobo of Billboard magazine.
Thank you, Hector. It's so nice to be here. I love that you said there's Eric Clapton's Leila. Because it's a great song and it has a great piano solo in the original version. So I like that comparison.
Yes, and I think obviously we need to remind all of our viewers out there that we are here to hawk and talk about this book, Decoding Despacito, which
this book, it's available in Spanish too. La Fórmula if you prefer Spanish.
And I could riff on it, but I want to read a little bit because I've read the book a couple of times. I think it's provocative. I'm a musician as well, besides being a longtime journalist and now being a curator here at the Wittliff Collections. I consider it essential reading, not only for music lovers, but I would say for musicians. I would say especially for musicians, because it lays out a very informative, provocative premise. It really sets parameters on sort of how we got here when it comes to Latin music. For those that haven't been paying attention, we're now in the middle of a second great Latin music explosion, post Despacito and post Ricky Martin. It's incredible. Leila's book talks about that. The way I see the book, she took 19 songs that are sort of guideposts, sort of essential listening, sort of turning points since 1970 to sort of explain that story of how we got here with Latin music and how it really happened. It's sort of as it's told in the form of oral histories. So you really get an insider's view from Leila Cobo, who is an insider. So it's a hologram of how some of these hit songs are made. They are often unlikely. You see that there's a lot of collaboration. Some of them follow this advancement of technology and streaming. So without any further ado, my first question, how did you decide to tackle such a big subject? How did you think, and what was your thinking in terms of organizing it?
Well, the original premise was a history of Latin music, and that was a very daunting proposal. They came to me with a proposal. They said, how about a history of Latin music? This was just post Despacito. This was in early 2018. And I thought, oh my God, that is such a hard thing to even fathom. And they wanted Penguin, the publisher, they wanted a history that a lot of people would want to read. They were seeing the popularity of Latin music and how do we tell people that story? And it was a very challenging thought. And eventually I thought, okay, let's do it via oral histories, but that kind of still left me in that bind of, what am I going to do? Am I going to do the oral history of every Latin genre? I will never finish it. This is because there's not just there's pop, and then there's Tejano, and then there's mariachi. There's all these subgenres of Mexican music. There's all the Brazilian music. There's all the, it's endless. Latin music is so rich. And I somehow remembered our oral histories of songs, which we do in Billboard, and which is one of my favorite things to do. And I thought, well, let's tell the story, but telling it via oral histories of songs. And when I say an oral history of a song, it means I'm not telling the story. The people telling the story are the people that made the song. And it's a beautiful thing because you start from the composer, which sometimes happens to be the artist, not always, but sometimes, but it's the composer, the artist, the producer, in some cases, the manager, in some cases, the executive, and they tell the stories. And what I did was I did an introduction to each of these songs. And because I knew that I couldn't tell everything, Hector, I thought, okay, we need to put a time frame on this, or else I'm going to go crazy. I will go crazy trying to talk about all the mambo and all of the boleros. And I set the start date. I set the clock at 1970 with a song that I thought had been a real milestone, and it was Feliz Navidad by Jose Feliciano. And so that song starts the history, and it ends with Rosalia's Malamente from 2018.
And for our audience too, in the title Despacito, I mean, I think everyone in the world has practically heard that tune. Yes. I mean, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's the hit by Luis Fonsi with Daddy Yankee that Justin Bieber added his twist to it and turned it into a global hit. And we're talking billions of views on YouTube and billions of streams and heard globally.
It's the most viewed video ever in the history of YouTube. Why we titled the book Decoding Despacito. I wanted a song that everybody, both young and old, had heard. And I figured that everybody had heard Despacito.
Yes, I think they have. It's the most listened to song ever. Just to sort of set that. And also, that, I mean, for me, 2 instances with Despacito, it happened twice in medical situations. I had a dentist with his hands in my mouth, asking me questions about Despacito. And then one time my eye doctor was just going on and on about Luis Fonsi and Despacito. Let me ask you this. Was it, I guess, too, for those that haven't read the book, or seen it or have bought it but haven't looked at it, maybe it'd be good, just quickly, Leila, if I maybe just name the 19 songs just so people. Sure. So we're talking about Feliz Navidad, Contrabando y Traición, To All the Girls I Loved Before, Conga, El Gran Balón, Burbujas de Amor, La Macarena, Prohibido, yes, La Tierra del Olvido, Suavemente, Smooth, Living La Vida Loca, Whenever, Wherever, Gasolina, Vivir Mi Vida, Bailando, Despacito, Mi Gente, Malamente. So it's a list, and I guess in certain ways you knew what the waters you're getting into, right? Anytime you make a list, people are going to say, "Why I'm not on it?" or "Why did I leave off?" Maybe that'd be a good spot. Were there some songs that almost made the grade for you, or that were right there? Were there some tough edits?
Yes, there were. We wanted songs, and I keep saying we because I wrote the book, I did the interviews for the book, yes, obviously, but we did have a lot of back and forth with my editor about what songs to choose, and we were very clear that we wanted songs that a lot of people had heard. We wanted these songs that had been milestones in the history of Latin music and in opening the door to Latin music. I wanted songs that in some way had been a before and after, beyond just the Latin music, the circle of Latin music fans. So some were super clear, Hector. I mean, like some were, you had to have them. You had to have Despacito. You had to have Living La Vida Loca. You had to have Mi Gente by J Balvin, because that song was the first song in Spanish to be #1 on Spotify, and then it was remixed by Beyonce. And I felt you had to have Conga. I mean, I think Conga was such a groundbreaking song. And the other song that I really felt you had to have was Macarena. And
Yes.
then from then on, there were a lot of fine lines. But I do think that every song that's here deserves to be here. There are a couple of songs that aren't here. Some aren't here because I couldn't get the artist. There were 3 songs where I could not get the artist, or I couldn't get them on time. And so finally I moved on. And then there were a couple of songs that had been maybes, and then the deadline came and we said, okay, we got it. We got it. We're fine with these 19. But yeah, there were some songs that in retrospect, I think, wow, I should have put La Camisa Negra by Juanes. I should have put something by Mana. I wasn't really clear on which
Right.
song.
Yes. I think what I love about the book too is that it's a starting point for a conversation, which I think you always get when you set parameters like you've set. And then also for me, and I would recommend this for anyone out there that either listens to this later or is catching the show right now, is to make a playlist on whatever device that you, because it really is fun to listen to the music like that and to sort of use it as a companion to the book, because it helps you understand a little bit where Leila was coming from as well. Because I thought it was extremely interesting that Willie Colon is there, with El Gran Varón. That in other words, a song of social conscience that maybe not all of us were familiar with. You almost make the case in the book that Smooth could almost not be there, even though, because it was such a big hit, but it's not really part of the Latin music explosion, though it has a Latin groove. It was really more about Santana's comeback, Carlos Santana's comeback, right?
Smooth really, yeah. Smooth is not a song in Spanish, and we largely define Latin music as music in Spanish. There's 3 songs here that are in English. Smooth is one, Conga, and Julio Iglesias, To All the Girls I've Loved Before.
Right.
And the one that's most in the border, I would say, as you mentioned, is Smooth, because Santana didn't conceive it as a Latin song. No, this was his comeback. But I have to tell you, the story of Smooth is so
Yes.
rich and beautiful. And even though it wasn't a Latin song per se, everything that Carlos was bringing to the table in terms of his style of playing and his groove and his Latin beat. And then when you hear the story of the lyrics and how Ital Shore, who's a songwriter who's not Latin, but is very connected with Latin culture, lives in New York, speaks Spanish, and the kind of song he wanted to bring to Carlos' music. And the third element there was Rob Thomas. And Rob Thomas was brought in at the last minute to help Ital with the lyrics. And Rob Thomas's girlfriend, who's now his wife, was Puerto Rican. And so that's why you have those lyrics. It wasn't that Rob was writing for Carlos. Rob was writing for his girlfriend, for his Spanish Harlem, Mona Lisa. And they both talk about that in the book, and it's beautiful. And even Santana says that when he heard the lyrics, he said, that guy has a Latina girlfriend, because there's no way he wrote those lyrics if he's not in love with a Latina. And he was right. So there's all these connections that I thought were beautiful, even though it's not a Latin album, even though it's not a Latin song. But Carlos Santana is also, gosh, such a powerful figure in music overall. And the way he took our rhythms to the world is admirable, especially considering he is an instrumentalist and not a singer. Yeah. So what he's accomplished, I really wanted to have in there.
Leila, talk a little bit about this. I mean, one thing I've come to believe about music journalism, and I think you're one of the greats, is that, part of the gig, or the biggest part of the gig, is like, 99.999% is being there. And you've been there. I mean, you've interviewed these people, you've organized the events, you've been on the ground through that period of this explosion too in the US. You know what I'm saying? As far as globally, and I think your perspective coming from Colombia gives us almost a 30,000 foot view. You're kind of within the beast, but also you realize that there's a lot of these other global influences that a lot of times Americans don't think about. Now, in your book, and because of the access that you have had over the years, maybe talk a little bit about the sense that, some of these songs, it's not predestined that they're going to be hits, but you do see time and time again these threads: the hard work, collaborations, sort of the advent of technologies that certain artists take advantage of, and also sort of a trust where a song begins as a nugget and then another artist either remixes it, sometimes on the sly, sometimes, you know, in full concert, and it becomes something that we all know and love. Can you give your take on that aspect of Latin music? Because it has gone, you know, we all love traditional music, but it has changed quite a bit.
It has. It has. I think in the book, what you see, each song is different, and each chapter is different in the sense that I spoke to different people for each chapter. In some, I spoke to the songwriter and the artist. In others, I spoke to the artist and the producer. The cast of characters shifts according to who was alive, who was available, who was important. But what the threads you see as you're saying is, first of all, it's very porous, I guess is the word, Hector. You don't know where it's going to go. And Despacito is a great example, because Despacito, once the song was done, once it was recorded, etc., then the label heard it and they said, oh my gosh, this song could be a hit. Let's put our might behind it. But everything that happened before that point, was very long. Like, he wrote it as a pop song. Then they said, oh, let's make it a reggaeton. That was his producers. And then they put the reggaeton beat, and then they said, we should have a reggaeton artist in here. Who should we have? And they called Nicky Jam. And Nicky Jam recorded it, and then he couldn't do it because he had an album coming out. And so they're like, oh, you know what? Let's call Daddy Yankee and see if he wants to do it. So it's like this kind of winding road, and then it becomes a hit. Others, like, they thought they had the hit. It takes a while, then it takes off. So yeah, there's a lot of collaboration, and there's one thing that I think is really important, is that you don't know where the collaboration is going to come from. You have Shakira co-writing with Tim Mitchell, who's this American guy from Detroit who doesn't speak Spanish, but he's been working with her for years. You have Los Tigres del Norte collaborating with this English producer that didn't speak Spanish. Los Tigres didn't speak English. You have in Mi Gente, you have J Balvin collaborating with Willie William, who's French. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think what makes each song beautiful, and I didn't know this coming in, was that each of them, it's not about, okay, you're from Mexico, so you can work in this Tejano song. You're Colombian, so you can work in my Vallenato song. No, it's like, everyone is welcome. Let's see what comes out of this. I love it. Let's do it. It's a very welcoming environment overall. And I think that's key, especially now that people are always talking about, no, you can't do this because you're not from there. You're not from here. You're not this, or you're not that. No, these guys were looking, and girls, they're trying to make the best possible song with the best possible people, with the people they have chemistry, and where they come from is irrelevant. All they want to do is make kind of beautiful music. I know it sounds kind of corny, but that is really what it is. And the other thing is that each of these songs is very unique and distinctive. Each of these songs in its moment in time really broke rank. Sometimes they were planning to do so, but other times no. But that's just what these songs really cut through. And I do suggest what you're saying. Read the chapter and then hear the song, because you do hear them in a different way after you read everything that went into them, things that you wouldn't catch even on 10 listens.
Yes, and I think, like, for example, if the audience will bear with me, but it was very interesting reading about Suavemente, and reading kind of what went into there, but also how things that you may not pick up on as a listener, like the Cuban grito and the kind of grit at first, when you see that the artist, that there's this sense almost of cultural pride, or almost sometimes, like with Mark Anthony, neighborhood pride, like from the streets, from the barrio. Hopefully this may work, just to give the audience a little taste of, we're talking about music. Do we have it out here? Oh. when you wrote that about, when you hear his words, of what the elements he wanted to add to that song, you go, oh, wow, okay, I get it sometimes. It's coming, it sounds corny, but for a lot of these artists, it's really coming from the heart and it's coming from the culture.
And Suavemente, he decided to start it a cappella because he loved Celia Cruz's Quimbara, no? Quimbara Cumbaya, Cumba Quimbara, which is a very iconic Celia song, which, by the way, in case you want to know, Celia is not here because Celia had passed away, unfortunately. And I really thought that a Celia song needed Celia. But Celia would start Quimbara a cappella, and Elvis loved that. So he said, I wanted to start it a cappella. And he also has this very piercing voice. He says in the book that he has the voice of a street vendor. And so he liked starting it a cappella. And he said, people, whether they like the voice or they don't like the voice, they will recognize that voice. And I wanted it to start a cappella so that everybody would be like, what, who is this guy? It's,
yes,
it's him.
And also, obviously the book is about, these musical moments, musical milestones that sort of correspond with sometimes, cultural movements and stuff. Let me ask you, just because you wrote a book about Jenny, how the deaths of Selena and Jenny Rivera sort of opened up the mainstream press, or a lot of people, to the sort of in other words, the outpouring that came upon learning about the deaths of these two artists really indicated how deep that connection was to these singing stars. So, I mean, a lot about, it's not only a musical revolution that's going on, right? It's part of a demographic changes that are happening, not only in this country, but also cultural changes. I throw it to you, Leila.
Yeah. No, well, those two deaths are great examples. When Selena died, well, Selena was she was almost there, right? She had picked up her Grammy. She was about to release a crossover album, but even so, I think it caught the world by surprise to see the huge reaction to her death and how emotional that reaction was. And then Jenny Rivera, what was it, 15 years later, 20 years later, same thing. And I think with Selena and Jenny, you had two artists who were born and raised here in the States. So English was actually their first language, but they sang in Spanish. And they were really connecting to people like themselves in a way that no one else was. And that was the magic of them. And those two deaths, I think, woke up everybody, I think me included, to the fact that there's this humongous population that really is avid for someone that looks like them, Hector. Someone that looks like them, that sounds like them, that talks to them. And there wasn't that person, because Mexican music was coming from Mexico, Colombian music was coming from Colombia, but they were really homegrown. And they were talking to people that were homegrown too. It was just very powerful. And it makes you aware that there's this big population that is underserved. And,
yes. And sort of the flip side of that too, I mean, with the knowledge that Selena would have turned 50 this year, is also though that the Latin music, or a lot of it, is being highly influenced by American pop culture as well, right? And like the African American music, hip hop, rap. I mean, these pop influences are changing the game for Latin artists, and the sort of the inflection, always infusing of new artists and youth, I think, is part of that formula. When you dig in and listen to the tracks.
Yeah, and you can't help that. It's part of, you can't help that. Like, music is out there, it happens. And so you feed from one direction and from the other. And now it's streaming. Now that the world is your stage, as opposed to, it's no longer your city or your state or even your country, the world. You can so easily hear music from all over the world, and the world can so easily hear music that's yours, that this kind of like cultural exchange and musical exchange and exchange of influences, it's inevitable. You can't stop it. So I think you'll see more and more this fusion of sounds. And as long as it sounds authentic to the artist, it's fine. It works. It works when people react to it, right? And if they're reacting, it's because something is connecting with them.
Is it a little maybe fascinating or strange for you? You know, you're inside writing about this, observing it all the time, you know, and with Billboard, you know, I think of the charts and following the numbers as well as the stories, right? But then, you know, when you look back at some of these hits you think were just a couple of years ago, now they're 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Is it maybe talk about that experience a little bit, that, you know, it's amazing that, you know, I mean, it's
feeling the steady passage of time on my shoulder. Well, there's one thing is Latin music is known traditionally, because I think this might be changing, but traditionally, we're very loyal to our hits and our artists. There's big Latin artists have a long time life. When I started doing this 25 years ago, a lot of the big stars from 25 years ago are still big stars today. So Latin fans are very faithful. But I also think that in this particular instance, you know, I picked songs that I thought were hits with a capital H. In other words, they weren't just hits that were a number one on a chart, because there's a lot of songs now that are number ones that you will forget in a year. These songs are hits, like they're hits. You're going to be singing all these songs. I think that even a casual Latin music fan will look at the book and they'll know half of them.
Oh, and yes, sure. I mean, I think a lot of the songs that you picked, and again, I got to remind people that are tuning in, you can buy this book by simply clicking at, you know, here on the website, but also at any, you know, book selling site. I would highly recommend it. You know, that I don't know. It just seems like Latin music, and especially as I was listening to the playlist, a lot of times it's sort of like a gateway, the gateway to, you know, like you're saying, these are big hits, and often I think that the effect is that it's a gateway to get more into that music, you know, and to get more into that particular album. Like, you know, we may have been say, for example, familiar with, one of the hit singles, but I would, you know, as I was reading the book, and a lot of times remembering or relearning what albums those came from, you know, it does make you want to go back and sort of, again, try to see that album in that context. And
it does. It does. And a song, I think a great example of that is Conga. You know, Conga is a song that Gloria and Emilio and Kiki Garcia, who was their percussionist at the time, they were just starting. And this is a band, remember, this is Gloria Estefan and Miami Sound Machine. They're a band from Miami. There hadn't been many bands from Miami. You know, Miami wasn't like New York or LA. I mean, we had the Bee Gees and there were a few things, but certainly nothing that sounded like these people. These people were Cuban immigrants. And so they play, they had one hit, which was Dr. Beat. And so they send them to do a little European promo tour. They go to play at a nightclub in Holland. And they had like 5 songs from their like Dr. Beat album. And so they're like, okay, what do we play? And they came up with this conga beat, which is what they would play here in Miami when they played quinceañeras, Hector. That's where that song really comes from. They were still playing gigs in Miami. You know, they were playing weddings and quinceañeras and little parties. And so they had like this recorded conga beat that they traveled with, and then they would sing over it. That's what they played. And then people went crazy. Gloria came out of the club and told Kiki, you know, that was such a hit. We should write a song that has the conga beat as the bass. And they start writing the song, and then the song is in English because she said that it was too percussive to sing in Spanish. Then they show it to the label, and the label says, oh, well, this is great, but it has too many horns and it has too much Latin percussion. So take that away, and then we can go to radio with it. And then they said, no, we're not going to take that away. That's the song. And finally, they fought to keep the song as it was. But that was the first single of that album, which was their big breakthrough album. So yes, I think to hear that song, to realize that there was a fight to get this song done. It wasn't like people were asking for the song. They thought it could work and they believed it could work. And to understand that at that time, no one was playing music that sounded Latin in the radio. Like it just wasn't happening. And so these guys really had to fight a battle. And all these songs, in a way, fight their little battles. Suavemente, you mentioned it. Suavemente was a merengue. Who was dancing merengue? They were doing merengue in Puerto Rico and in the Dominican Republic. Here they were doing salsa. You know, merengue wasn't a thing. And then this guy with this song broke into the Hot 100, which is incredible. I think it's the only merengue track that's ever done that, by the way. So.
And you know, and Gloria is not only a pivotal figure. I mean, it's we sometimes forget that Selena was kind of being groomed as a Gloria Estefan type. I feel like with her record, and I've always thought it would have been very interesting I mean, unfortunately, we'll never know. But when that album was slated to come out, I mean, that was the year of Alanis Morissette's breakout, incredible record. Selena would have been coming, to the mainstream during the era of Lilith Fair. So it would have been, the story. It could have had a lot of twists and turns, which,
She's been amazing. Was amazing. I mean, she was amazing. And I very much wanted a Selena song in here. And I thought, well, Selena's dead. That kind of breaks my rule. And I thought, if her father agrees to speak with me, then I can tell the story, because they were such a close-knit family, right? And he always traveled with her. And I decided on Amor Prohibido because it's my favorite Selena song, really, to be quite frank. And I called him and he told me the whole backstory of that song. And that chapter is very much Abraham's voice telling what inspired that song, which I didn't know, by the way, which is a real story of his grandmother in Mexico. And I think it was a beautiful story. It was less technical than the other ones. It was very different, but I think it's very beautiful and very moving.
Yeah. And revisiting that song too, which you can't avoid here in Texas, but we love Selena and Amor Prohibido. But it really is sort of almost like a love child for the Supremes kind of was. It has a little bit of that, that theme is always one that seems to work. Let me ask you this. One thing I was very interested in with you, Leila, I'm a musician. You are an accomplished musician. How much does being a musician sort of inform either your enjoyment for it or sort of appreciation of the songs that you picked? I mean, does that sort of play a role sort of actually?
It plays a huge role. I mean, I can't imagine. I'm not saying that you have to be a musician to write about music, because I don't think that's the case. I think there's amazing music critics who are not musicians, and I read them and I'm like, wow, this is such an understanding of what it is. But in my case, being a musician is very integral. I think there's two pieces to it. Because I'm married to a musician, to a recording musician, I go to him a lot for questions about recording and production and loops and sounds and technique. So I go and playback and stuff like that. So I go to Arthur quite a bit. His name is Arthur Hanlon. He's a pianist. So I go to him a lot. But I think that as a musician, where it most helps me is, even though I wasn't a superstar musician, because that's obviously not the case at all. But I think just the fact of having been on a stage allows me to relate better, and I think put them at ease when we speak, because it's such a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to be a musician in the first instance. It's very difficult to get on a stage. It's very difficult to achieve this kind of success and to maintain it. So every time I interview a musician, I really approach it with from a place of deep respect, where I'm like, you kind of rock. You've been able to do this. You've been able to be the one among 10,000, and wow, this is very respectable, and let's talk about it, and let's talk about how you built that melody line. And then I can get into minutia, that sometimes surprises them. Oh, and here, why did you go into the minor chord, etc. But I think the big advantage is that I can sit with them and kind of very respectfully respect what they've done. Sorry for being redundant.
No. And Leila, also I want to remind the audience too, if you want to submit questions to the chat, do that to us, and I will read them and ask Leila. Let me ask you this: one of the aspects in the book that I thought was very interesting was the role of Tommy Mottola, the Columbia music executive, sort of really, they're in the late 90s, and they're really pushing for this Latin music explosion. He felt it, he wanted it to happen, he made it happen. Can you offer a little bit from your vantage as a music industry insider? Did he just have a crystal ball? Was it the numbers were telling him that? What was it that was driving his enthusiasm for that and being such a believer? Because he really,
he was very important to that period. He was very important. He had several things. He had a couple of staffers that were in his ear telling him all day, oh my God, this is the next thing, this is the next thing, this is the next thing. And it so happened that Columbia, Sony was a Columbia label. Or Columbia was a Sony label, but anyway, Sony Latin was one of the labels under his purview. And their artist roster included Ricky Martin, and it included Shakira. It included Gloria and Emilio, for that matter. It included Gloria Estefan. So he had people in the territories saying to him, oh my God, have you paid attention to this Ricky Martin kid? Because when he goes to Argentina, he plays for 100,000 people, and we're selling X million copies in Latin America of this guy. So he knew what was happening because he had the numbers, and he knew that there was something there. And then when he finds out that that Ricky actually speaks English, that he was in General Hospital, etc., then they take on the gamble. But Tommy was very important for this. He really was. And the timing was good, and he had, like I said, just an amazing roster of artists, because you can't really replicate Ricky Martin, Hector. It's not like there's 55 Ricky Martins, there's one. And then Shakira was also very unique. And then Mark Anthony. These are very unique artists. So it's like all the pieces aligned.
Yeah, it's remarkable when you go through just to think. You can pinpoint that moment at the Grammys when Ricky Martin performed there in '99, and then they had the album ready. They had Livin' La Vida Loca ready just almost immediately afterwards, and it just you really at that moment in time you can pretty much pinpoint it. And it also, if we think back, that's also sort of riding that same crest of the teen pop explosion that's happening with boy bands, is all happening around that same time there in the late 90s. And, pop music is sort of changing in itself right there,
Yeah. And also remember that this was a time when you could do that, when a Grammy performance was watched by so many people. Now the market is so diluted, and you have cable and streaming, and you don't get those same numbers. But at that point in time, getting there was, now you have many more avenues, but so I guess it's easier in that regard. But back then, if you were able to get to that point and then have a platform like the Grammys, and then have that performance, Hector, because again, it's not like this was just any performance. This was an amazing performance. And I would, if anyone is watching who hasn't seen it, look it up, because it's really it's very wow to watch. And it was a Grammy Award. I remember I was covering it, and it was kind of a boring show. And then this guy comes on stage, and he is phenomenal, and he's singing The Cup of Life, and he's dancing, and it's all these Brazilian drums, and everybody gets up. It was really very wow. And it was like an overnight thing. You had this guy who was a superstar in Latin America, suddenly the US sees him and he was a superstar like overnight here. But there was a lot of work before.
Another part of the book that I really love too, and we've heard the different stories, but the Julio Iglesias and Willie Nelson collaboration is just almost too funny, and just some of the comments from some of the parties that were involved, and to sort of remember, or if we didn't know, like, because I've interviewed Julio over the years, but you don't realize that at that time, we're talking about in the early 80s, about 83, 84, he really couldn't speak English very well. They get together there in Austin, and Willie does his part, and then Julio can't do it and has to sing it later. It's just it's amazing. And you don't listen to the song the same after reading that story. After reading your book, you don't, because you're listening to how Julio's singing that line. It's still a beautiful song.
It is, but you know what? It's something when I interviewed Julio, and he said, he told me, he said it's really easy to pronounce. That it's to all the girls I've loved before. And even at that time, I thought, to all the girls I've loved before. I always thought the song was to all the girls I loved before, but no, it is to all the girls I've loved before. And that is hard to say. So I commiserate with Julio.
We do have a question here from Valerie, and Valerie wants to know which song, if you can do it, was your favorite to research, from the list. Was there one that maybe that you got into the weeds more than you remembered, or?
No, there were several. Each of them had their charm, but I love researching Macarena because that is the story I was least familiar with, I have to say. I really did not know that story, and I didn't know the intricacies of the remix and the fact that it took like 2 years for it to rise. So that was really interesting. Conga was really interesting because that song I thought I knew inside out, and I didn't.
Yeah.
So
I've got to recommend the book. I mean, obviously that's why we're here. So I would highly recommend to click on the buy button for it. But the way you approached it, I think, is amazing. I think any musical lover and musicians will get a lot of info from the book, from the stories, because like you said, you get the oral histories of these producers, the songwriters, the artists, and you set the boundaries, because had you just gone back, say, one more year, you would see where, and this is a little Texas pride, but where Renee and Renee of, a duo out of Laredo, Texas, hit around, I want to say, number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 with a bilingual hit, Lo Mucho Que Te Quiero. They'd hit the Hot 100 back in '64 with Angelito. But, as you keep going back, you can find, that impact of Latin music and Latin artists, where they're singing bilingually in Spanish and English. Even Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a little bit of Spanish, and if you're Chicano or if you're Latino, you're seeing some acknowledgement there. So,
what song you should have mentioned, Hector? What song I was very sorry I didn't include? La Bamba.
Oh.
La Bamba should have been there, and because of the remake, right? Because of the Los Lobos remake. But that song should have been there. And at the beginning I said no, because it precedes the date. And then, of course, Los Lobos redid it all those years later when the movie came out, and it went to #1. And I finally didn't put it in, and I thought, no.
I see book number 2.
I want to do a book number 2.
Well, anyway, Leila Cobo, we've come to the end of the session. It's been enjoyable on my end. I think I loved it. I loved hearing those stories. I love the book, and thank you so much for being part of the San Antonio Book Festival, and thank you for having us. So I think this is our cue to hang up. So.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind you all, you can get it in English, you can get it in Spanish, It's in digital format and it's an audiobook as well, Hector. I read it in both languages. So if you prefer audiobook, it's there.
All right. We'll be waiting for the second edition and the second list so we can talk about that as well. Thank you, Leila. Thank you all. We're signing off. Bye-bye.